Rebel Wilson is now accusing powerful Hollywood figures of orchestrating a coordinated smear campaign against her. But this isn't just a dispute, because the same names, Rebel Wilson, Amanda Ghost, Len Blavatnik, and even Blake Lively, are now showing up across lawsuits, PR strategies, and media narratives. And according to Rebel, this isn't random. It points to something much bigger, a system operating behind the scenes, shaping who gets protected and who gets targeted. And if you trace this back to where it all started, it doesn't begin with lawsuits or PR. It begins with a film that was supposed to change everything. What makes this situation difficult to follow is that it didn't begin with lawsuits or leaked audio. It started with a film. Rebel Wilson's directorial debut, The Deb, was positioned as a major milestone in her career, not just as an actress, but as a filmmaker with creative control. The project had already gained momentum, even securing a high-profile premiere slot at the Toronto Film Festival. And for a moment, everything appeared to be moving forward, until it suddenly wasn't. According to Rebel, the turning point traces back to October of the previous year, when she claims she began noticing what she described as inappropriate behavior from key producers on the film, including Amanda Ghost, Gregor Cameron, and Vince Holden. At that stage, these concerns weren't public. Instead, Rebel says she raised them internally, expecting the situation to be addressed behind the scenes. But based on her account, that didn't happen. What followed, according to her, was a breakdown in trust, and eventually a much larger dispute over control of the project itself. Because The Deb wasn't just another acting role for her. It was a project she helped develop, co-write, and direct, meaning the question of who controls the film became central to everything that came next. And this is where the situation starts to shift from a creative disagreement into a legal one. Because soon after these internal conflicts surfaced, multiple legal actions began to emerge, including claims of defamation, disputes over demand letters, and accusations tied to what allegedly happened during production. At the same time, something else changed. The film's planned premiere, which should have been a defining moment for Rebel, was suddenly blocked. And from that point forward, the conflict was no longer contained behind the scenes. It had moved into public view. But what's still unclear at this stage is how a production dispute escalated so quickly into multiple lawsuits across different countries, and why the narrative around Rebel herself began to shift so dramatically in the media. Because according to her, that shift wasn't accidental, and that's where the next phase of this story begins. But what makes this even more unusual isn't just how fast this turned into a legal battle, it's what happened next when the story itself started to change. That story begins with a film, The Deb, a project Rebel Wilson says she built from the ground up. As the legal battle escalated, so did the public narrative. And this is where Rebel Wilson's claims take a more serious turn, because instead of framing this as just a dispute over a film, she began suggesting something more coordinated was happening behind the scenes, specifically what she describes as a deliberate PR campaign to damage her reputation. In a series of public statements, Rebel pointed to what she called a bombardment of negative media coverage and raised the possibility that crisis PR firms were involved in shaping that narrative. Now, that's a significant claim, because in Hollywood, PR firms don't just respond to stories. They can influence how those stories are framed, which details are emphasized, and, in some cases, which narratives gain traction. According to Rebel, the portrayal of her as difficult or problematic on set didn't match her past reputation in the industry, where she had previously worked on multiple large productions without similar allegations. So, from her perspective, the shift in how she was being described publicly raised questions. And it wasn't just about reputation. She also connected this alleged PR activity to the ongoing legal pressure she was facing, including multiple lawsuits filed across different jurisdictions, and even claims tied to a demand letter being treated as defamation. At the same time, another development added fuel to the situation. A leaked audio recording, reportedly involving Jed Wallace, began circulating, with discussions around exposing one of the producers involved in the dispute. That leak quickly became part of the broader conversation, with some media outlets interpreting it as evidence supporting the idea of a smear campaign, while others questioned its significance. So now, the story wasn't just about what happened on set. It had expanded into a battle over who is controlling the narrative and why. But there's an even deeper layer to this, because as Rebel continued speaking out, she started pointing toward a figure who sits above the producers, someone with significantly more influence. And once that name enters the story, the scale of this situation changes entirely. But if this was just about PR, it wouldn't explain the scale of what followed, because behind the producers, there's another layer to this story, one that involves far more influence. As the situation intensified, Rebel Wilson introduced a name that shifts the scale of this entire story: Len Blavatnik, a billionaire investor, major media owner, and someone with financial ties to the film and the people involved in its production. According to Rebel, this is where the conflict moves beyond a dispute with producers and into a question of power and influence. In her public statements, she claims that Blavatnik was not just connected to the project, but that his funding has been linked to multiple legal actions brought against her across different countries. Now, that claim is important because it introduces the idea that the legal pressure she's facing may not be isolated. Instead, she's suggesting it could be part of a broader, coordinated response, backed by significant resources. Rebel also shared what she described as direct communication with Blavatnik, where she raised concerns about the behavior of the producers and asked for intervention. But according to her account, the situation escalated. And this is where the narrative begins to shift again, because once a figure at that level is introduced, the focus is no longer just on what happened during production. It becomes about who has the ability to shape outcomes, not just creatively, but legally and publicly. At the same time, Rebel pointed out something else she found unusual. She questioned why certain media coverage appeared to exclude or minimize references to Blavatnik's involvement, suggesting that key details might not be fully represented in how the story is being reported. That observation raises a broader question. If one of the most powerful figures connected to the situation isn't being consistently discussed, what impact does that have on how audiences understand what's happening? And more importantly, who decides which parts of a story get amplified and which parts don't? Because as this case continues to unfold, the pattern that's emerging isn't just about conflict, it's about control. Control over the project, control over the legal process, and potentially control over the narrative itself. But there's still another layer that hasn't been fully explained yet, because as these connections expand, the same network of legal teams, PR strategies, and public figures begins to overlap with another high-profile name, and that's where the story takes an even more unexpected turn. And once you start looking at influence at that level, the connections don't stay contained to just one case, because the same networks begin to appear elsewhere, involving names you wouldn't expect in this story. Up to this point, the story has centered on Rebel Wilson, her producers, and Len Blavatnik. But then, another name starts appearing in the background of this situation: Blake Lively. Now, to be clear, Blake Lively is not directly part of Rebel Wilson's film dispute, but according to the narrative being discussed, there appears to be an overlap in legal teams, PR networks, and industry relationships that connect these cases in a less obvious way. And that's where things become more complex, because within the filings and commentary surrounding this situation, there are references to shared legal representation and coordinated PR strategies being used across different high-profile cases. Rebel's side suggests that these overlapping connections may not be coincidental. Instead, they raise questions about whether the same network of influence is shaping multiple narratives at once. At the same time, there are claims that media coverage has focused heavily on certain angles, while avoiding deeper discussion of these connections, which creates an unusual dynamic. Because when audiences see separate celebrity stories, whether it's Rebel Wilson's dispute or anything involving Blake Lively, they're typically presented as isolated incidents. But here, the suggestion is that they may be part of a shared ecosystem of legal strategy and public narrative management. And that's a very different framing. It shifts the story away from individual conflicts and toward something more structural. However, it's important to approach this carefully, because while these connections are being pointed out, they are still interpretations based on overlapping relationships, not confirmed coordination. But even so, the pattern itself is what draws attention. The same types of firms, the same types of legal tactics, and similar shifts in how public narratives are formed. So the question becomes, if multiple high-profile situations appear to follow a similar pattern, is that just how the industry operates, or is there something more deliberate happening behind the scenes? And once you start asking that question, now it's no longer just about individuals, it's about how influence might move through the system itself. So when you step back and look at all of this together, it starts to feel less like isolated situations and more like something structured. At this stage, the story begins to move beyond just Rebel Wilson, and even beyond the specific individuals involved. Because when you step back and look at the structure of what's happening, certain patterns start to emerge. First, there's the sequence. An internal dispute becomes public. That dispute is followed by legal action. Then, almost simultaneously, a shift occurs in how one party is portrayed in the media. And alongside that, PR narratives begin to form. Now, none of these elements are unusual on their own, but when they appear together, repeatedly, they start to raise questions about how these situations are managed at an industry level. In Rebel Wilson's case, she's pointing to what she believes is a combination of legal pressure, PR influence, and financial backing all working in parallel. And whether or not that interpretation is accurate, the structure itself is worth examining, because similar dynamics have been observed in other high-profile disputes, where conflicts don't just play out in courtrooms, but also in headlines, public perception, and reputation. And in those situations, outcomes aren't always determined solely by what happened. They're also influenced by how the story is told and who has the resources to tell it effectively. That's where power becomes a factor, not just creative power over a project, but strategic power over messaging, legal positioning, and timing. And this is what makes Rebel's claims significant, because she isn't just challenging the actions of individual producers, she's questioning whether there's a broader system that can reshape narratives in real time. At the same time, critics of her position would argue that this is simply how disputes escalate in high-stakes environments, especially when large financial interests are involved. So there are two competing interpretations here. One sees a coordinated system of influence. The other sees a standard, if aggressive, industry response to conflict. And right now, both interpretations exist side by side. But there's still one more piece of this that hasn't been fully addressed, because as this situation continues, there are still gaps in what's being publicly discussed, and those gaps may be just as important as the information we're seeing. But even with all of that, there's still something missing, because some of the most important pieces of this story aren't being talked about at all. As more details continue to surface, there's another layer to this story that's harder to track. Not what's being said, but what isn't. Because throughout this situation, Rebel Wilson has repeatedly pointed out that certain elements, particularly the role of powerful financial backers, are not being consistently addressed in mainstream coverage. And whether that's intentional or not, it creates a gap in how the story is understood. For example, While the focus has largely remained on the conflict between Rebel and the producers, far less attention appears to be given to the broader network of influence she's describing. The funding, the legal coordination, the potential role of PR strategy. Instead, much of the coverage centers on surface-level conflict. Who said what, who filed which lawsuit, and how each side is responding publicly. But if even part of Rebel's claims are accurate, then those surface details may only represent a small portion of what's actually happening. And this is where things become more difficult to evaluate. Because gaps in coverage don't automatically mean information is being hidden. There are many reasons why certain details don't get amplified, including verification standards, legal risk, or simply lack of evidence. At the same time, selective focus can shape perception just as effectively as direct messaging. If audiences are only seeing part of the picture, their conclusions will naturally reflect that. So the key question becomes, are these gaps the result of caution and incomplete information, or are they part of a broader pattern of how complex industry disputes are presented to the public? At this point, there isn't a definitive answer. But what is clear is that the way this story is being told may be just as important as the story itself. And as the legal cases move forward, those missing pieces could become more relevant, especially if new evidence, filings, or testimony begin to fill in those gaps. And until those missing pieces are fully addressed, it's almost impossible to know where the truth actually sits in all of this. At this point, the Rebel Wilson situation is no longer just about a film dispute. It has evolved into something much broader, involving legal battles, public narratives, and questions about how influence operates behind the scenes in Hollywood. On one side, you have Rebel Wilson raising concerns about misconduct, legal pressure, and what she believes to be a coordinated effort to damage her reputation. On the other, there are ongoing lawsuits, denials, and a very different interpretation of the same events. And in between those two positions is a complex web of connections involving producers, legal teams, PR strategies, and powerful financial figures like Len Blavatnik, with overlapping narratives that even touch figures like Blake Lively. But here's the key point. Much of this is still unfolding. Court cases are ongoing, claims are being challenged, and the full picture may not become clear until more information is formally presented and examined. So for now, what we're left with is a developing story, one that raises important questions about power, narrative control, and how conflicts like this are shaped both legally and publicly. And those questions don't just apply to this case, they apply to how many of these stories are told. So I want to hear your perspective. Do you think this is simply a high-profile dispute that escalated out of control? Or does this situation point to something deeper about how the industry operates behind the scenes? Let me know what you think in the comments, because this is one story that clearly isn't over yet.